also outdoor. Didn't start, but
I think so.
okay, but you get the picture why we asked Albert to talk to us about this topic, and he'll basically certainly do a better job to go into more details of stuff that I also mentioned. So yeah, let's enjoy.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jacob. So the good news is that we actually were able to put the air conditioning a little bit higher. It turned out the temperature was low enough, but the setting was not on high yet. The bad news is, as Jacob said, there's always a lack of space. You can see there's a little bit of a lack of space here. Only a few of my slides deal with the lack of space. Most of them are a little bit easier to read. So if you are thinking like, he's going to talk today for an hour and tomorrow for 4, that's not the case. I'm going to talk today for an hour and tomorrow for a bit more. Most of the time tomorrow we'll do a role-playing game. So if you come tomorrow, come at the beginning, because if you come later, the roles are already assigned. We're going to have groups of 6 each. So let's say we have 24 people, then we divide it in groups. If at some point there's an extra people, there can be some roles that we have 2 people, because some of the roles are a bit more complicated, so someone can assist. So tomorrow I will do a bit more introduction to the role-playing game. Now I will try to follow up on Darko by making some of these things hopefully a bit more concrete. Not concrete in the sense of actually pouring concrete like he was shown for the US and China, although some of it has to do with it as well. So, here's some of the spaces falling off: New Zealand, Chile, but maybe you can't read it back anyway, Mexico, Germany. These are 4 randomly picked out of, I think, 12 or 16 graphs that the former UN rapporteur Lailani Farah used in a report on the financialization of housing. And sometimes I use different ones, because it doesn't really matter which countries you pick. It doesn't really matter if they're in Europe, it doesn't matter if they're in America, it doesn't matter if they're in the global south. All these pictures are more or less the same. You see this dotted line? This always starts at 100, because it's index numbers, which means they fall from 100 and then they're easier to compare. And what you basically see in each country, the income level is more or less flat. This one here, this was Chile? Yeah, that's Germany. So this one in Chile goes up and down a little bit more, and you see more or less overall the same effect. Then the other line are the nominal house prices. So that's corrected for interest rates. They also start at 100, and you basically see in each of these countries they grow apart. If I would have picked any of the other examples that she put in these graphs, it's the same picture, because this is what happens around the world. So people often say, my country is very specific because house prices go up and the wages don't go up as much, or there's other very specific things that people say, it's very specific to the culture of my country, people want to own a home. A lot of those things are quite universal. It doesn't mean that there's exactly the same kind of home owning culture. It doesn't mean that all the reasons that these house prices go up are all just international. What I'm just trying to say is that if we try to understand these things only at the national level or only at the urban level, we actually miss a much bigger dimension or a much bigger thinking. So this happens in most cities and most countries around the world. This is of course just at the national level. If you would start doing this for capital cities, you would often see even a more extreme picture where median income goes up a little bit more, but then the house prices go up even much more. Of course there are exceptions to the story where the house prices do go down, but they're really a small part of the story. Or they're a short part of history where this happens and then the house prices go up again. So, I'm going to discuss some of these things around one central concept that I introduced about 10, 12 years ago, which I call the real estate financial complex. As Darko was already saying, I lead a research group where we look at the intersection of real estate, finance, and the state. And I call that group the real estate financial complex. And as I said before the break, I'll try to give some more examples. So, I'll go between examples and more abstract reasoning. And I won't always show you all the evidence for how I come to the more abstract reasoning. I'll show you little snippets to hopefully make it a bit more understandable. And then I'm also going to try to pitch to a different audience. People who already know a lot of these things, I hope they will pick up a little bit more. People who don't know a lot of this, I hope you will pick up a fair amount. But if there's some things you don't understand, I think that's possible too. That's fine. You can still understand some of the things later on. So I'm trying to pitch this to different audiences. So, examples. Does anyone know these companies? Let's start with Pirelli. What does Pirelli do? Tires, yeah. Anyone else? Calendars? Were you saying calendars in the back? No? Because there's always one person who says kind of who's in the back, and it's about a 50-50 split if it's a man or a woman who mentions the colors. They make others too. They make tires, but they're mostly known for, well, not known for, but what's the main part of their business is, how they make most of their profits is real estate. I'll get to that in a minute. General Motors. What do they make? The name already suggested. Cars. Yeah, cars. What else do they do? No, it's not real estate. I didn't want to make it that easy. What's the other option? Finance. So General Motors is a financial company who also happens to make cars. Pirelli is a real estate company who also happens to make tires. Actually, most of their tires are made by other companies, mostly in South Asia. They make the tires, they just buy the tires. So this is also to show that the way we think about our economy is very much like, oh, there's banks on the one hand, and there's things like private equity funds that might be a bit complicated, but you might have heard of the name. And then there's pension funds and insurance companies, those are all in finance. And on the other hand, there's companies who make stuff. But actually, a lot of these things are also intersecting. And why are some of these companies doing something else? The short answer is because they can make more money that way. If you can make a little bit of money by making tires, but you can make more money by putting that money in real estate, why would you not do that from a capitalist perspective? So that's the easy reasoning these companies follow. So here's some of the examples of how Pirelli is involved in real estate. What Pirelli mostly does is actually management of buildings. So they don't own so many buildings themselves. They do the management of buildings that are owned by investors. And those investors don't have, their own management company for the real estate, so Pirelli does that for them. So it's not necessarily a big real estate investor, although they do some of that as well. Then they organize also networks of real estate agents, so people you buy a house from or rent a house from. Again, they don't own the network, they organize the network. So they're very much about the organization of these things rather than about a lot of these ownership. Another example, we don't have any Italians in the room, do we? One Italian in the room, so you know what this is?
Milan.
Yeah, where is it in Milan?
Underground periphery.
Yeah, so this is in Milan Bicocca. So I lived in Milan for 6 months and I was actually at a university next to this building. So for some of you may know, some of you may not know, but Italy has some of the largest universities in the world. So sometimes they just get new numbers, and basically it's almost like a new university. That's what they did in Rome, that's what they did in Napoli. In Milan they said, we just start a new university, and we call it Milan Bicocca, in the Bicocca area of the city. And what they basically did is, they bought the land from Pirelli, who was not making tires there anymore, and they planned there a big new university campus. It's a very big university. And they planned a mall, offices, etc., etc. And this building itself is owned by Pirelli. It's a new build, at the old site. And this is, I think it's called an incinerator. So this is one of these things you see in big factories that smoke comes out or something. And they built an office building around it. So for me, this one picture is symbolic of this transformation of Pirelli going from an industrial company to actually a company organizing space, organizing real estate. Then if you look at General Motors, at some point General Motors started its own lending company. Not a full-fledged bank originally, but a lending company. And why did they start a lending company? Because cars are expensive. And what makes it easier for people to buy cars? If they can get a loan. What makes it even easier to get a loan? If you can give them the loan. So this was a way to sell more cars for General Motors. At some point, GMAC, as is known, became an independent company because the philosophy changed and the idea was an independent company can make more money, they would do it this way, and that money comes back. Then, once they had done that, they started their new financial company. So they kept spinning off financial companies. They did this 2 or 3 times, depending on how you define a financial company, in the course of a few decades. And always thinking, okay, with finance we can make more money for the cars, and then this finance operation started to take over. And also still nowadays, General Motors does a lot of investment in other companies, by which they make more money than by the cars they produce. At some point about 10, 12 years ago, some of the cars that General Motors made were so polluting that they could not export them to China. Chinese cars were cleaner than some of the cars General Motors was making in the US, because they still make some cars in the US as well. And so General Motors got bailed out, GMAC got bailed out in the financial crisis. Part of it, as a financial company, continued as Ally Financial Bank. So they still exist, but now independent from General Motors. At some point I'm going to fall here, then you already know why. It's a problem because I like to walk around. So the bailout here, the Department of Finance, the Treasury came in, bailed it out. And then another company came into the picture who sort of rescued one of these financial institutions, basically meaning they bought them at a very low value at the depth of the financial crisis. And that's Cerberus. Does anyone know Cerberus? Not the mythical creature, but the company? No? This is a company that owns, it's one of the big companies in the world who owns stuff in everything. They own real estate, they own banking, they own hospitals, they own education. Why do they own those things? Because they buy up things that they think are undervalued, they keep them for a few years and they resell them. The people from Berlin, you don't know Cerberus? Cerberus is what became Deutsche Wohnen. Cerberus bought up houses in Germany. GSW is one of the biggest housing privatizations in Germany, probably one of the biggest in the world. I think it was 65,000 units or something like that were privatized in one transaction. So not the right to buy that Darko talked about before, where individuals buy their house, but in GSW, a whole social housing cooperative, I don't think it was technically a cooperative, but a whole social housing organization was privatized and sold to Cerberus. So Cerberus is private equity funds who just owns things because they want to resell them in the future for a higher price. Their model is not to charge the highest rents necessarily. Their model is if we can buy something cheap and resell it higher, so bring the exchange value up, to use Darko's terms, that's how we can make money. So this is what they try to do. They bought up public housing in Germany. And that company is now Deutsche Wohnen. Deutsche Wohnen is much bigger than just DSW because they bought up all these different portfolios of former social housing in Germany. Deutsche Bank also bought up one of those portfolios, also ended up in Deutsche Wohnen. And now some of you have may heard of Deutsche Wohnen and Eignen. Not dispossess, what's the right word? Disappropriate Deutsche Wohnen. So the campaign which won in the referendum to take housing away from Deutsche Wohnen and Vonovia, the two largest landlords in Germany. Vonovia, most likely the largest in the world. They're also now merging, so the largest landlord in the world is merging with one of the other largest ones. Deutsche Wohnen is the biggest in Berlin. Vonovia is the biggest worldwide. They own about 450,000 housing units. 380,000 in Germany, 70,000 spread over Sweden and Austria. And then they have joint ventures with a French semi-public bank as well, and they have plans to expand elsewhere. So a lot of examples are set, but that doesn't mean it's easier. People maybe found like, examples are going to be easier than this abstract talk, but you see this is not easy at all. All those things are connected, but that's in a way what I'm trying to show you. So here, a picture of what I was just trying to show for Germany. Here, this is not just Berlin, this is some of the biggest housing privatizations in Germany. I met them with a former PhD student, Katja Weiber, who's now based in the US. And we looked at some of these biggest transactions. So we're talking about 24,000 units, 15, 11, 22. Here we see GSW, the one that Cerberus bought up, 66,000, 30,000, 50,000, 93,000, the very largest transaction in North Rhine-Westphalia. So all the way to the west of Germany. The story how it's often told, both by people in Berlin, but also by the media, is that often this is a story about Berlin, this is a story about East Germany, but actually this has happened throughout Germany. Relatively speaking, more housing has been privatized in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the very west again of Germany, than has been privatized in any other state in Germany. So this is not a story of the post-socialist states of Germany, this is a story that's played out throughout Germany. That's also why you saw a lot of these big transactions. These are just a few examples. 2 to 3 million housing units have been privatized over the time. So here in light blue you see that they were owned publicly. It's a little bit of cheating because, as I said, some of them were publicly owned, some of them were cooperatives, some were some sort of foundation. And then I'll skip the white part, but the green part is when they're bought up by private equity and hedge funds, which are these funds like Cerberus that just use money to buy something cheap and sell a few years later to make more money. So again, they may raise the rent, but their main business model is to sell something for a higher price than they buy it. So these are the ones in green, and these are all based either in the London metropolitan area or in the New York metropolitan area. This is where most of these institutions are generally, and the ones that bought up the housing are all based there. There's one exception, and this is this one here, Prelios, which is Pirelli, and our Reef, which is Deutsche Bank. They cooperated to do one of these transactions as well. Otherwise, these are all London and New York based transactions. One of them also with money from Goldman Sachs. And then what we see in purple, purplish, lilac, is actually a new phase of financialization coming in, where these ones, as I said, were making money basically by speculating, buying low, selling high. What these ones in purple are doing is actually owning it longer term. So these are internationally typically known as real estate investment trusts. More generally, they're known as real estate funds. And they work on a different business model. Of course, if they can sell something for a higher price, they might do it. But their basic business model is to make money to the rent coming in. So it's important to understand that this is a different kind of model between the green and the purple. The green is much more speculative capitalism, where it's really like you're coming for a quick buck. It may take a few years. You restructure the company, you load it with debt, you resell it. The purple ones are in it for the long run. They are not planning to sell the real estate. Also, these companies in purple, they do only one thing. It makes them very easy in that sense, they do real estate. And typically they only do housing. And in many cases they do it in one country, or they do it in a few countries, typically neighboring countries. So as I said, Germany plus Sweden and Austria. There's another one who does Germany and Poland. In the US there's one that does US and Canada. But very often in smaller parts of the world, these are not big global funds. But why they are in a way globalized? Because the money behind it is global. So a lot of the money that goes in here is not just money from London or New York. A lot of that money comes from pension funds. Darko mentioned it before. So pension funds put their money in these real estate funds, who then own a lot of housing in places like North Rhine-Westphalia, in Berlin, in Dresden, in Frankfurt, and so on. So now, after some of these examples, a little bit more how I think about these real estate companies. So when I started doing this 10, 12 years ago, my frustration was that on the one hand you had political economists who talked about finance, they talked about the states, and typically at the national level they studied how these things worked. And on the other hand, you had people in urban studies, and some of them did something I would call critical real estate studies. That's not a common term, but they studied housing, they studied other forms of real estate. They also looked at the role of the state, but typically the local state. So the level of analysis here was national and global, and here it was urban and local. But they didn't talk too much to each other, these people, because they had different interests. And what I started seeing in the global financial crisis, and I wasn't the only one, I'm not trying to claim that it was my unique idea, is that actually we need to bring some of this together to understand what's going on. If we want to understand at the urban level what's going on, we have to understand some of the things here. Neoclassical mainstream economics is not going to help us, but a longer tradition in political economy, where you have Keynesians, where you have Marxists, you have regulation school, all of them coming together, makes more sense to understand what's going on, but then you have to come to some understanding of how that money comes down into the system and what it does there. So I try to bring these things together, and I do that around 7 propositions. And as I said, not all of them I'm going to show how they work, because otherwise we'd be running out of time. But I'll give you a few illustrations, and I've already given you a few illustrations. So, first, real estate and finance have grown at the relative expense of other economic sectors. Also, Darko has touched upon this a little bit already. If you look, for instance, at where profits come from in the economy, the amount of profits that goes to the real estate and financial sectors grows over time. The number of people employed in those sectors also increases, but just by a little bit. Because you would say that, well, if these are growth sectors, but they also create a lot of jobs, it wouldn't be so bad. But the thing is, they create only few new jobs, but a lot of the more profits go to these sectors. So they become more and more important for the economy, but not necessarily that much more important for employment. So the other thing is, here I'm just talking about real estate on the one hand and finance, and they happen to have a similar trend. That doesn't mean they're connected. The second argument is that they're interdependent. The growth of real estate and the growth of finance are very much related. Of course, finance does a lot of other things. It goes into IT, it goes into mining, it goes in all kinds of other things. But why is the connection to real estate so important? There's many reasons, but I'll just share one of you, which is that you can put more money in real estate, globally speaking, than in anything else. Yeah, so there's so much real estate, especially since everyone needs to live somewhere. So even if you don't own your house, someone else owns it. That means that someone else owning the real estate, some money went into there. That means this connection is already important, but it's becoming increasingly important. And as the housing prices go up, it eats up an even larger part of the economy. The third one, which I will now illustrate with an argument again for Milan, is that the interdependence results in delinking and volatility. And hopefully it will be clear what I mean by delinking. So I was just talking about the copper site, this former Pirelli factory that is now a university and a mall and everything else. That's here. And this line is the border of the city of Milan. I'm now going to talk about this area, which is the folk site in the city of San Giovanni. So the ring to the north and the northeast of Milan is known as the red belt around Milan. Red because this is the industrial belt that people used to vote communist or socialist there. So that's the tradition of this area. But nowadays, it's sort of the least attractive part of the city, rundown factories. It's relatively poor. Housing is built up very densely, not just very tall buildings, but also the density of the buildings. Some of them were built with a crane, so they could do the blocks, the flats, 12 floors on both sides with one crane to save some money. So the density there is quite big. So this folk site is the one that I'm going to focus on. So again, it's important that this is not in the city of Milan, this is in a smaller municipality who doesn't have the power in a way to run a big redevelopment project. As you can see here, the other black ones are all redevelopment projects mostly within the city of Milan. And Milan has a very strong tradition of directing the main redevelopment projects themselves. They have as many redevelopment projects as cities like Paris that are 3-4 times as large as Milan. And I would say they're very successful in it on their own terms. If you look at their terms of what they want to do there, it's often mixed-use projects. They are often bringing them to completion rather well. From our perspective, we would probably say, well, there's not enough social housing, it's not inclusive enough. And that's a fair critique. But from their own perspective of the city of Milan, they do quite well actually what they want to do. And I think they're better at it than most cities in Europe. It's not a picture we might have of Italy of government being well organized. But Milan, I think within Italy is also a bit of an exception. But the city of Sesto is quite different. So this folk site, this used to be owned by the Falk Corporation, it's a steel company. And you don't need to look at the whole thing, I'm going to go through it. So don't try to look at everything now because you will not follow my story. Just look at it as I pointed. So I'm going to discuss the years from 1990 to, not to the present, to when we stopped investigating this. Who owned it? And then a little bit more about land, about finance. So in 1990, this Falk Corporation steel company, they stopped producing steel there. They moved the steel production elsewhere because, of course, it was cheaper to do it somewhere else than was to do it in Italy. But between 1990 and 2000, they still owned the land there. And the land was a brownfield, so meaning it's polluted, it wasn't very attractive. It was also considered to be on the wrong side of Milan, on the poor side of Milan, so there were no plans to redevelop at that moment. So here it says something about the model of the original company. That's not that important. Expected gains on investments were not defined because they just happened to own the land because they had a factory there. Their goal was never to own the land to make money. The goal was to own the land to have a factory there that could make the money. So the land was in a way something they just needed, practically speaking. It had a use value for them, no exchange value. I don't know how much they paid for it because it's decades and decades earlier when they got the land. So in the year 2000, they're able to sell the land. This land that's polluted, and again on the wrong side, and they sell it to a holding company called Gruppo Bossini. And Gruppo Bossini, it's a holding company, but there's basically one investor behind it, who is a local real estate investor from the Milan area, well known within the Milan area for snapping up sites, often a little earlier than global capital comes in because he has better connections and things like that. So he's really using his local knowledge. And what does he do? He pays 140 million for this site. It's a big site, but 140 million is a lot of euros. And how does he pay for this 140 million? He doesn't have 140 million. The company is not that big. He borrows 200 million. Just imagine you buy a house for, I'm going to do it in euros now because I don't know how much it will be in dinar, but let's say we do 140,000 euros you want to buy a house for, and you can borrow 200,000 from the bank. So you borrow more money than you actually need to buy a house. It's quite a rare opportunity. What we can't show black and white, but when I was investigating this with an Italian colleague, when I was still based in Amsterdam, and he was too, Federico Savini, we basically know that he wasn't planning to redevelop the site. His plan was to lobby the government to get permission to redevelop the site, because once he would have the permission, he could resell the land for more money. So he lobbied the government to change the zoning of the land from industrial to basically high-end mixed development, the stories you see everywhere. So he was successful in that, it took a few years. He owned it from 2000 to 2005, and in 2005, just 2-3 years before the financial crisis, he resells the land for 298 million. So he doubles the land, and basically his biggest expense has been paying the interest on his loan, which is quite large because it's a large loan. And the other main expense has been lobbying the local government, which didn't cost him much money because they were very eager to have someone do something with that site. Yes.
But do you know how he got this bigger loan? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know the details
Okay.
of how he organized it, but we do know he got it, and he got it under the premise that the land is worth more than 140. So that's the argument he would have used.
Yeah.
And actually he was correct, because he was able to sell it for more than double less than 5 years later. So he didn't spend much on lobbying, he just spent some money on interest. And at the same time, since he borrowed more money, he used some of that money to invest somewhere else. And so the next owner is Grupo Sonino, which is again a holding company. And in this case, there's multiple people behind it. Most of them are Italians, but they're not exclusively Italians, and they're not just from Milan, but from the wider Italian area. And they pay down 88 million, so that means they don't borrow all the money. They borrow more than 2/3 of it and more than 1/3 of it, which is a lot of money, 88 million. That's why they need a large group of investors to do this. And we see here that the original group lobbied for development of 734,000 square meters. If you're not an architect, it probably doesn't mean that much. But what is important here is that the new group, who paid more for the land, lobbied to get 1.1 million square meters. So they were doing a much larger development, almost 1.5 times as large. And again, why did they need to do that? Because they paid much more for the land. So to still make a profit, they wanted to lobby the government. Again, went very easy. If they would have gone to the city of Milan, probably they wouldn't have managed, because the city of Milan would have decided what happens there. But since this is the city of Sesto San Giovanni in the periphery of Milan, a city with less than 100,000 people, a very small urban planning department, not with any knowledge how to do big projects, they were just like, okay, great, yeah, let's do that.
And they get the tax.
And they get?
And they get the taxes, no?
Well,
So
eventually, if something happens. So we know that Grupo Pacini didn't have the capacity to develop. We know that Grupo Sonino, some of the actors in there may have had the capacity to develop, but still it would have been quite difficult for them, so they would have needed other partners. But what they did in 2010, they again sold the land. What happened in the meantime? Of course, a big financial crisis, which also hit Italy quite hard, but not Milan necessarily so much. So you think like, well, if a big crisis happens, and the house prices go down everywhere, the office prices go down, then clearly the cost of land must go down. No, it's not the case. Even in the crisis, they were still able to sell the land for more money. So this underlines Darko's point that this scarcity of land in there, because we don't make more of it, as Mark Twain used to say. A few exceptions to not making land undone, so we used to make some extra land, but even that has its limits. So in this case, they used 60 million in cash, and they used a whole complicated deal of financial schemes. They're not just borrowing money. We explained this here in a few lines, but I still don't understand completely what's going on. Because it's not designed for us to understand. So I'm not going to try to make you understand what they did, just so you know they have complicated financial engineering behind this to make the project possible. We think that BC and partners, again, are holding. In this case, it's mostly international, so we go from a steel factory, local, national, international. We think that they actually wanted to redevelop the land, but it became difficult, they ran out of money. Also, they started to do a slightly smaller project. We're not exactly sure why they didn't want to go for the 1.1 million square meters. Maybe they found the density was too high to actually sell some of the real estate within it, but we don't know for sure. And our paper stopped in 2016, and then after that, BC and Partners sold it to a number of, again, international investors, but now mostly from the Arab world. So still international, but more specific about one place. And again, there's not much redevelopment taking place. So this goes on. And of course, this is just one random example. This is not typical for what happens everywhere, but I do think what is typical is this, the land price going up, and this one, the financial model becoming more and more complex over time. Those are things that you
How
can
much
do.
did you sell it for to the Arab investors?
More. I forgot, I don't know by heart how much. And I'm not sure actually, based on the information we have, if we can deduct the real price. Because that's the other thing. Some of the financial model may then have a participation of an old group in something new, and then it's very hard to know the exact price.
How do you define the expected gains on investment?
We know how they try to sell the project. Because they all develop a project. They all have a brochure where they say, this is the nice
But it's
glitzy thing we're doing.
self-defined.
Yeah, and then they need to find more investors, so they define how much they want to invest. So that's actually the easy part, to find that.
Yeah.
This is the much harder part,
Yeah.
to find out. So, a little bit abstracting from this Milan example. So we see the attachment here between, on the one hand, the planning process at the local level, and the logic of finance, the logic of investors, which is at different scales. It starts at the local scale, but then it scales up to much other levels. What they want to redevelop there has very little to do with the needs of that area. It's a mostly working class area. It's not a high unemployment rate, because unemployment rate in Milan in general is extremely low. But still a relatively low income area where there's no need for a mixed use project with expensive offices and expensive apartments. And I don't think there's going to be much of an actual demand from it from rich people either, because they wouldn't want to live on the other side. What it shows is that land has become, in the words of Philip O'Neill, an Australian geographer, an arterial route in the circulation of finance. So it's not just like, oh, you need to borrow money to buy the land. No, actually, you can borrow more money than the land costs and then use that money somewhere else. So it becomes a spot where, in a way, you touch the land without physically doing anything in it. And either you make money by selling it for more, or you are able to borrow more than you paid for it based on the future expected profits. So it becomes important for the circulation of finance in that way. And then this is the more abstract part where if you get lost for a minute, that's fine if you check back in a minute. So in political economy and urban studies more widely speaking, David Harvey is very influential Marxist geographer. And he says that land is seen as a spatial fix for investments. People need to put their money somewhere because it can't always move around, you need to park it somewhere. So he calls it a spatial fix, but what we see now is that land is no longer just a fix for overaccumulation, for extra profit produced somewhere else, but it is also mobilized to create leverage, to get extra credit, and to seek profitable investment elsewhere. So some people would say Harvey was wrong. I would say it goes beyond what Harvey said. He wasn't wrong, he was right, but maybe he was more right than he realized at the time, because he wrote that in the late 70s and mid 80s. And a lot has happened since. So yeah, maybe reality first caught up with Harvey and then went beyond Harvey. So back to the propositions. I've done number 3 now as well. So number 4 and number 5. Real estate holds a special position within the contemporary financialized economy. I already mentioned how real estate is the biggest thing you can pour money in, so that's one reason that's the case. The other part has to do with what I just explained from Harvey. And then now I'm telling this with some examples from different places. I'm also suggested a little bit with the graphs at the beginning that the same things happen around the world. That doesn't mean everything is exactly the same. But I think it's also too easy to say that everything is different and places have their own history. There's always a lot of talk about path dependencies, and surely Serbia has a different path dependency than Italy, or Belgium has a different path dependency than Romania. But still, we also see that there's not just that path dependency that makes something change, but there is also actually something happening at different levels that don't mean that all of a sudden now Serbia and Italy are the same, but still some of it goes in the same direction. Those development of the prices go in the same direction without necessarily all the underlying factors being the same. Some of the underlying factors stay typically Serbian or typically Italian, but some of the underlying factors become more general across places. So a bit more following up from the Harvey claim. I suggest that the absorption of capital by real estate, so the ability of real estate to basically take in a lot of money. So from an investor point of view, real estate being expensive is almost seen as a good thing because you can park more money in it. So the absorption of capital by real estate, which includes housing, is for me one of the defining characteristics of what we can call financialized capitalism. So again, this link between finance and real estate. The role of real estate in capitalism, this is not necessarily new, and again, David Harvey talked about it, is to solve or manage the capital absorption problem. Keynes also talked about that. And we often think there's not enough money, because we know more people probably who don't have enough money than we know people who have too much money. But globally speaking, there's too much money looking for investment. And real estate is able to absorb that money because there's so much of it, and the more expensive it gets, the more it can absorb it. And that's also one of the reasons that for some investors, it's very attractive to have an empty apartment in London. Because if you have one empty apartment in London, you don't need to buy 10 empty apartments in Amsterdam or 25 in Belgrade. So a lot of transaction costs to buy 25 apartments in Belgrade. Just one apartment in London will do, and you can park all your money there. So it's, in that sense, much easier. If you're really filthy rich, London or New York, putting your money in there is much easier. So again, David Harvey calls this a spatial fix for overaccumulation. So if profit is made somewhere else, these cups that Darko was talking about, one of your cup company does really well. What are you going to do with your money? Are you going to make more cups? No? So one of the things you can do is you can put it in real estate. Yeah? Or you can put it somewhere else where you think the profit rate is higher. At some point, if you keep on producing more cups, the prices are going to go down. So it's better for you not to start making more cups. You can try to outcompete your competitor. That's a risky business because if they make profit as well, they try to do the same and the prices go down. So if you think of a metaphor of a pizza, that pizza size is going to stay the same. It's just going to be divided between different people owning part of the pizza. But the pizza itself stays the same size. So it might make more sense sometimes to not compete for a bigger slice of pizza, but to move into a bigger pizza. Into a pizza where there's plenty of space to grow. And to make the pizza even bigger and bigger. And real estate and finance gives you that option. Yeah.
Yes, you put the limit of the amount of square meters built in some city. Also, you give the prices to go up for the existing apartments.
In many cases, yes. Yeah. But there's a very loose relationship between how much real estate there is and what the prices of them are. There's places where, as we saw in the first hour, someone already mentioned, it might be that there's no demand for actual housing and the housing prices still go up. So it's not so easy. I started with an easy answer, but it's actually not that easy. It really depends how you do it. It also depends if you limit capital coming in. If you say we don't build more space, but we also make it difficult for external capital coming in, we can be able to control it in some way. If you say we don't build any more, but all the capital come in that they wish, then most likely the prices will skyrocket. But yeah, it depends a lot on how you recommend.
The money in the real estate, where do you think it will go?
Right now,
Like
it will go
somewhere
to
simulation.
it will go to real estate somewhere else. Yeah. Yeah. So unless you do this
Also
locally.
in Serbia.
Yeah.
Look, right now in Lisbon we have this huge push for more legislation because if you follow, and you probably follow, it's insane with the prices of real estate. Because the real estate prices of rent, it's like really the most expensive city to live in compared to what people earn. So there has been a lot of protests, huge protests in April, and just a lot of activism around this, and really big push for the government to do something. And now there have been several new laws introduced. And actually, the very funny thing was that some of the investors, they tried to protest. They actually gathered, and they were like, if you do all this, then no, it will not be profitable for people to invest in real estate, and then who will buy real estate? And we were all like, well, we need somewhere to live in, but it's so big, the kind of, like the role of real estate in capital accumulation is so huge, it's actually just a tiny bit of it is to people who actually live in this. It's just a seen as financial.
And I think governments, a lot of them still, and a lot of them until recently, always thought like, well, more investment in housing is great, right? If you get more investment, you get more houses. But the problem is most of the investment in housing goes in existing housing, not in new housing. So very often it just drives up the prices. That's what the German example shows very well. They just buy up 3 million units of existing housing. Well, then if someone is willing to pay more money for it, that probably means they will try to squeeze out more rent from it. So this is often what will happen in the case like that. Okay. So what we see here is that the growth of real estate debt, for instance mortgage debt, is outpacing economic growth. Just like we saw that house prices outpace income levels. And what was the example that Darko had again? It wasn't income levels, it was wages and productivity. So on each of those things you see the lines growing apart. And this all starts over in the 70s for some of the reasons that Darko explained and for some other reasons that we won't explain. Because we don't have time.
You figure it out.
So then an example where this money comes from. Darko mentioned pension funds. I'm just looking here at Dutch institutional investors. Institutional investor basically means pension funds, insurance company, and quasi-state funds. In the Netherlands, the quasi-state funds are not important. In some other countries they are. But the pension funds are usually important. In the Netherlands, it's just a small country, but the third largest pension fund in the world is a Dutch pension fund. Where when I was still teaching at the University of Amsterdam, some of my money went in. So I have a marginal part of that pension fund. Because that's the pension fund for people in government and education. Which means that in the Netherlands it's by far the largest pension fund, and that makes it the third largest in the world. So you don't have to look at all the colors here. They're interesting, but it's too much detail for now. What I'm just trying to show here, that actually in some countries the pension funds are in a way quite well organized, in the sense that the amount of money they have is preparing for the population getting older. So we just looked at 82, 92, 2002, 2012, so it's 10 years apart, so soon we should be able to add to 2022. I don't think those numbers are available yet, and I say we because I did this with another former PhD student, Jonas van Loon, who now sadly works for the real estate law. It's one of my big films. But what I'm trying to show here is that the amount of money, again, not looking at what they put it in, is basically doubling every 10 years. Of course, the Dutch economy doesn't double every 10 years. The profits don't go up that much. Wages definitely don't go up that much. So in this sense, the amount of pension fund money increases much faster. This is good news for Dutch pensions. It's good news for my parents who are retired. And for the little bits that I get, maybe by the time I have to retire, maybe I have to be 75 by that time, it will be good news as well. But this also means that, again, the amount of money is growing much faster than the productivity in the economy, which means that money needs to go somewhere. And where does that money go? It goes increasingly into real estate. So, to show one of my earlier arguments. So, what is the most interesting one here is the white spiked bar. This is the money that pension funds put in real estate funds. So, not real estate they own directly, but these kind of funds who own parts of Berlin and parts of other German cities. So, in 1982, they barely owned any of it. In 1992, so basically it went 10 times as high. Then 3 times as high in 2002, and then it quadrupled to 2012. So not just do the pension funds have more and more money every 10 years, also a larger and larger share of it goes into real estate. They also used to own direct real estate, that went up a bit from 82 to 92, and then a little bit more and went down. But you see, even though this is almost halving the amount of real estate they own directly, I mean, compared to how much the growth is in indirect real estate that they own through someone else's funds, you can almost neglect this one. The other two bars are for insurance funds, so they have much less capital, but it shows a similar but less pronounced trend. And then here, those kind of funds, real estate funds that I mentioned before, that are active in the 2 largest markets in the world. The 2 largest markets for housing real estate funds, known as residential real estate for investors, are Germany and the US. So we looked here at the 11 largest funds in the US and the 4 largest in Germany. And basically, each bar here, each color is a different fund, and it doesn't matter so much now which are the German ones or which are the US ones. We just wanted to look at the 2 largest markets and how much these companies are worth. So this is not purely the prices of the real estate, but these companies, you can buy stocks from them on the stock exchange. And one of the colleagues I often work with, Rodrigo Fernandez, you see here at the end, he's very good in doing this kind of corporate research, and he always says it's much easier for companies on the stock exchange because you can get all the data. He does a lot of research on tax evasion, that's what he's more known for, and he always goes after the ones on the stock exchange. And yeah, then you can actually see where the money comes from. So he follows the money. So here we looked at what those companies are worth on the stock exchange starting in 2000 and then going to 2020, and you basically see, yes, it can go up and down a little bit, financial crisis, COVID crisis, but basically the amount of money in these funds has exploded over the years. We have to say that some of these funds didn't exist in the year 2000, but by this time they all existed. You see, most of the growth is not in these first 8 or 9 years. It is basically from the financial crisis onwards. So even though some of these funds didn't exist yet, for most of the growth, it's kind of irrelevant. So here again, underlining the argument that real estate is really where all the money goes. let's see the time limit. Okay. And so this is an old picture where ING Bank mapped where they have a specific legal infrastructure in place for one of these kind of funds. As I was saying, the ones in Germany are not real estate investment trusts, but the most common form of these funds are real estate investment trusts. And the orange ones here already had them 10 years ago or so. The blue ones at the time were considering it. Most of the blue ones now have these funds, and many more countries have joined. I would like to do an updated map of this, but it's actually quite a lot of work to find it for each individual country. And the interesting thing is also that it's not just something that started in the US in 1960 and then quickly moved to Europe. You can see a lot of European countries actually only joined 10 or 15 years ago. The UK was quite late 2007, the Netherlands was early 69, but you see Australia and New Zealand were early 71, but also Brazil was relatively early 1992. In the meantime, yeah, you would have to place twice as many dots on the map. And you'd say like, well, it's not a very clear picture. You'd say like, well, there's not a lot of them in Eastern Europe, but Bulgaria is here. So it's not necessarily the case. You think like, well, there are fewer in the African continent, but South Africa had one by now. I think there's 5 or 6 probably in the African continent. They expand very fast in Latin America. Many of that, especially the southern half of Latin America, they all have these funds now. So it's not just like, oh, this happens in the global north and not in the global south. It happens quite randomly in some countries but not in others. A lot of it has to do with the strength of the lobby. It's mostly financial investors lobbying for this infrastructure, legal infrastructure to be implemented. And why do they do that? Because if the country at the federal level introduces a law, basically they have tax advantage. So basically they say, we want to put money in real estate and make your houses more expensive. Oh, and also we don't want to pay all tax. And we don't want to do it by evading the tax illegally, we just want to do it legally. We just want you to give to us the right not to have to pay taxes, or not as much taxes. So it's much easier. They don't have to go necessarily to tax havens. They just ask, like, can we please have an advantage because we're going to invest in your housing and in your offices, and it's going to be great for everyone. But as we just saw a few slides back, it's not necessarily great for the expert. So I don't think this is maybe overstating it a little bit, but they are in many more countries. So as I said before, I'm not arguing this, all of this is exactly the same everywhere. And this is something I wrote from Colin Hay, political scientist, political economist from the UK. And he says you can basically, if you start comparing 2 countries, and this is time, and this is whatever indicator you compare them on, you can have 4 basic scenarios, assuming there's change in stability. So that's the first assumption. And he says very often people talk about convergence, and then they think of this. 2 countries coming from a different situation, one low, one high, and they become more similar over time. He says this is typically the thinking that people have. He says, but one is actually a much more common one that we see internationally much more often is scenario number 2 here. In this case, it's 2 lines going down, and many of the examples I would use, it would be 2 lines going up, which suggests that these countries actually grow apart over time. So it's divergence, countries become less similar over time, but he says the more interesting thing is the direction. The direction is the same. And so I mentioned before, well, let's compare Serbia to Italy, because I have a few Italian examples. I'm not arguing that this is happening, that this is Italy and this is Serbia, and become similar over time. I'm basically arguing with something more similar to this, where they undergo the same trends that Darko would have called financialization earlier, but we can give it many other names. But it doesn't mean that Serbia and Italy in this case become more similar over time, but they undergo the same trends, which has some of the same consequences, but it doesn't mean that over time they are more similar. They can still be as dissimilar, they can even be more dissimilar. So I always think this is a very useful way to show this. By thinking, this is not just the only possibility, getting closer or going further apart. You can go further apart and still have the same trend happening in those countries. So we get to the end of the talk, which is good, because there's 10 minutes left. So states have enabled and further the growth of real estate, finance, and interdependence. So the example I just showed of these funds that do these kind of things is one example. Darko again mentioned securitization, where mortgage loans are being resold. That is also something that's only possible if the government at the national or federal level has introduced legislation to make it possible. If the government doesn't introduce that legislation, it's not possible. So you often hear people say like, oh, but it's all the deregulation, and we used to have regulated finance, now we have deregulated finance. My short answer to that is bullshit. We actually have more regulation of finance, but we have regulation that is more and more favoring finance. So it's a different kind of regulation than we used to have. It's not completely a black and white picture. A lot of regulation historically was always already for the financial sector. A lot of lobbying also, according to the media, is companies saying we want less regulation. In fact, a lot of lobbying is saying we want this specific kind of regulation. And why is it? Either to get an advantage in taxes, or to be able to securitize, or to get the scale advantage. Because if you're big, it's much easier to deal with regulation than if you're small. So for bigger players, it's easier to outcompete the smaller players if there's more regulation. If a small landlord has to deal with a lot of regulation, it might become too complex for them. For a big landlord, you hire 1 or 2 people, you own a few thousand units, it's not a problem. You just make it easier to buy up from the little man. Or the little man. So then the last one, this real estate financial complex is not just organized at the local, at the national level, but also at the urban level. Of course, this is kind of obvious because I already gave some examples at the urban scale. But tomorrow in the introduction, I could go into it a little bit now, but I will leave the rest for tomorrow, not to overheat myself or to overheat you. I will do a little bit more on the urban level, which then also will function as a bridge from today's talk to the role-playing game we do tomorrow. So again, if you're there tomorrow, please make sure you're there in time. So once the role-playing game has started, it's much more difficult to join. But since I'm ending now a little bit earlier, we have a little bit of time for questions, I think, Jacob? Yeah?